Go to TAPgiles.com to learn dreams, engage my services, and support the channel. Check out the previous video in the series to learn how to have a character point in the direction the player is pointing with their stick. Now we'll add a few more features to the logic. We've got a robot here, and I'm going to add a tag to it for us to aim at. I'll call it target. And then in our rig, we can have another lookout rotator that aims towards that tag. I'm using up and down on the D-pad to cycle through the tags in the scene. Then we'll turn our other lookout rotator off. And now, while we run around near the robot, it doesn't really change anything. That's because our rig isn't following the character. It's still back here. So while it's matching the orientation of the character, it's not matching the position. So let's tweak the teleporter and turn on match target position. And now it'll jump to wherever our character is. But it's kind of offset from our character. This point here should be representing our shoulder. So when it's teleporting, we want that point to be at our shoulder. We can adjust that with the gizmo of the teleporter. The gizmo determines the orientation, as we saw in the previous part, but also the position it will end up in. So I'll use the grid to adjust that. I'll scope in because I want to use the grid of this object. So I'll use L1 and triangle. I'll make the gaps between the dots a bit bigger and use the grid again. And now we have a nice clear dot in the center of that cube, and that's what I'll use to position this gizmo. While grabbing the gizmo, I'll use triangle to snap it to the nearest point on the grid, and then move it into position. And remember, Y points left and Z points up to match our tag. So now it's right where our character is, so we can't really see what's going on, but it is pointing towards the robot, even when the target moves around, but it's kind of huge. The cool thing about this method though is, you can make this as tiny as you want, and it will work the same. So now in playtest mode we can see the hand and the rig, and they're both pointing in the same direction. And we can make it invisible again, and see our hand is pointing towards the robot. In some situations when our hand is pointing back like that, the hand kind of snaps back and forth for some reason. This is to do with the arm vigour setting of the character. If you have the puppet running with low arm vigour, it doesn't look so great. So for this character I have it turned up, which looks more natural. But then when we're controlling our arm, it makes it kind of twitch like that sometimes. So while we're aiming, I'm going to have another keyframe which turns down the arm vigour. Depending on how you have things set up, you might have to do a bit more logic work here, but that's how you can fix this problem. So while we're aiming, the run is a little less convincing, but the player's trying to aim at stuff, so that's probably not what they're focusing on. But the main thing is it doesn't twitch anymore when we're pointing back a little. Now if we copy this controller sensor into here, we can have our aiming activate only when we're pushing enough on the right stick. If we get a calculator and use the right stick local, when we're pushing on the stick left or right, we can see this value get higher depending on how far we push the stick. So we can say if that is greater than some number, then we want to send out a signal. Now if you push left, even though this number here is higher than 0.5, it's not sending out a signal. That's because it's a fat wire, so we're not really checking that number. We need to convert it down into that single number before we check if it's greater than 0.5 for this to work properly. A trick you can use to do that easily is use L1 and X on this little input tab to cycle through the wire blend modes. Put it onto the X icon which is modulate. That will multiply how far we're pushing the stick by what we have in the setting. So if we set that to 1, we'll just be using how far we're pushing the stick, and then see if that is greater than 0.5. So now when we push right, or push left, or any direction, we're getting a signal from the calculator. And you can wire that to power the timeline. Now I can slowly push right until we snap into aiming mode. And it works just as before. I'll move these up here so that the wires are nice and tidy. We don't need that. And we have our shoulder tag up here. The last thing I'll show you is how to make the character flip instead of pointing back behind them. So as we aim left, instead of just pointing back, we'll turn the character 180 degrees. In our chip over here, we want to know if we're pushing the right stick left. If we open our splitter, we can see the numbers we get for the X and Y components. When we push left, we're getting a negative number on the X. So if X is negative, we want to change the orientation of our character. So with the calculator, we can say if X is less than 0, then we know we're pushing left. And we can use that to power a keyframe to adjust other things in here, which we'll get to in a moment. I'm just going to put an empty keyframe down and power it with the calculator signal. And now the keyframe is powered when we are pointing left on the stick. A gadget that orients objects within the scene is the gyroscope gadget. We can find that in movers and output, and I'll get a gyroscope gadget. If we tweak this, we can see an arrow. It will rotate the object so that that arrow is pointing up. But if we turn on Align All Axes, it will keep these other arrows oriented to the scene as well. If I play time, the character will orient so that Y is pointing up, X is pointing along the X axis, and Z is pointing along the Z axis. Normally we want the character to face the X axis as it is now. So let's adjust the gizmo so that the X is pointing the way the character is facing. So we drag the X to the right. And now the character is standing as it was. But when we are pushing left on the right stick, we'll adjust the gizmo so that the back will point along the X axis. I'll add a switch gadget for testing, so I can just leave that keyframe on and see what happens. So the keyframe adjusts the orientation of the gyroscope, and our character turns around 180 degrees to face left. And that will be happening while we're pushing the right stick left. Just like with the lookout rotator, we can turn these settings up and make it faster to make it more snappy. Let's try that out in play mode. So aiming right works as normal, but aiming left flips our character. So the arm keeps pointing forwards and up and down, and never pointing behind, but the body turns to make it work. I'll turn up the speed to make it even more snappy, but you can adjust these things however you like. But remember, when we're pushing just a little bit on our stick, we're not aiming quite yet. But our gyroscope logic doesn't know that. When we push just a little bit left on the right stick, our whole character flips, even though we're not aiming. We only want that to happen when we are actually aiming. So how do we do that? We know we are aiming when this timeline is on. So if we put the gyroscope into that timeline and make sure it lasts the length of the timeline, then the gyroscope will only work while that timeline is on, when we are aiming. So now pushing left just a little bit doesn't do anything, but when we get to actually aiming, the character snaps into aiming mode and turns. We could even have a switch so that we can turn this feature on and off. This will plug into the gyroscope's power. So now we have a setting to say whether aiming should flip our character left and right. So with the switch on, our character flips left and right. And if we don't want that feature, we can just turn it off. And now we'll aim behind us. This kind of method is useful even when we're not working with a 2D game. If we tilted this bolt onto its side, it would work for a top-down view instead of a side-on game, and all the logic would work the same. You'd have a timeline, with poses to point in different angles, but instead of pointing in a circle like this, it should point in a circle round like this, but it would all work the same. I hope you have fun using this method in your games. Drop a link in the description if you implement something like this. I'd be interested to see it. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe, and I hope you have fun developing games.